Welcome back to the AR Files presented by 9-Hole Reviews and brought to you by Slate Black Industries. Head over and check out slateBlackIndustries.com. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the hotly debated topic of optic height. That is, selecting the correct mount height based on how high you as an end user want your optic to sit above the receiver. This applies to both red dot style platforms as well as LPVOs and other magnified optics. Optic height can actually be particularly influential on a number of elements ranging from the user's subjective feelings on being behind the gun, shooting, managing recoil and tracking the sight, and even their perception of their surroundings while doing so, through to mechanical components like zeroing and offset. So let's get into it. For starters, let's lay down some basic principles regarding optic height with some generalizations and concepts you can chew on throughout the rest of this video. On one end of the spectrum, we have short mounts, aligning the optic approximately with the height of standard iron sights. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the tall mounts. These would be approximately the same height as an optic mounted on top of a carry handle on a traditional M16 or M4 platform. And then we have everything in between. So let's talk about the attributes of optic heights on the extreme end of the spectrum first to establish our guardrails. And we'll start with the shortest mounts. First off, the shorter mounts require the user to press their head deep or lower into the stock in order to see through the optic. This allows for a very positive cheek weld, which aids in recoil control and repeatability on mounting the gun to a degree. There is less height over bore as well, meaning less offset to account for on close-range targets. Further, the shorter height also allows for traditional battle zeros like the 25 and 36 yard zeros to be quite effective with limited over-under deviation out to standard engagement ranges of 300 to 350 yards. If you're not following this piece, we'll discuss more specifics on rifle zeros and the relationship to mount height in a separate session. And lastly, the shorter height is also much more comfortable and natural when laying prone behind the gun. Naturally resting your head down on the stock generally results in being able to see through the optic without having to crane the neck back or upward. With that said, when shooting standing, the lower height mounts require the user to drive their neck and head down and forward, and some users will also need to tilt their head down, having to look out the top portion of their eye in order to get behind the optic when standing. This can be quite cumbersome in a move and shoot environment. A good bit of this is influenced and dictated by how deep in the shoulder pocket the user places their stock. And while the lower height mounts offer flexibility in choosing any number of zeros, there are schools of thought that suggest that the 25 and 36 yard battle zeros are simply outclassed by other zero options, potentially negating this afforded flexibility. And lastly, although this is a bit more of an extreme use case, lower optic mounts are extremely difficult to use in conjunction with night vision for passive aiming. Again, perhaps not all that applicable for the majority of users, but if you are interested in night vision, this should absolutely be a consideration. Now, on to our tallest mounts. As you may have gathered, we're basically going to flip the script completely on the short mount. Tall mounts are much more comfortable for the heads-up style of shooting with the neck and head in an upright position. This advantage is offset and balanced out by a less positive cheek weld for the user, risking worse recoil control. In addition, tall mounts create a more significant height over bore and require greater offset management, balanced out by having a much better passive aiming capability for use with night vision. And although they do lack the ability to effectively utilize a 25 or 36 yard battle zero without major shifts in point of impact between 125 and say 300 yards, this is balanced out by maintaining the ability to run a 50, 100, or 200 yard zero without any real difference to lower optic heights. With these fundamentals laid out across our spectrum, let's describe the most popular sight height options available and where they sit on the spectrum. There are effectively 5 core options, and then some ancillary choices we'll review. We have Absolute Co-Witness, Tube Optic Mount Standard, Lower 1/3, 193, and 226. Absolute co-witness refers to placing the sight directly in line with where the iron sights would be, right at about 1.42 inches above the top of the receiver. Almost all manufacturers will be within a fraction of an inch here. Now, tube optic mount standard is a term we use to describe mounts for tube-style optics, as in LPVOs or magnified optics, which range in height based on the manufacturer anywhere between about 1.5 to 1.57 inches. This particular area is a bit messy since some companies have an absolute height tube mount at exactly 1.42 inches as their quote-unquote standard tube optic mount height, whereas a good bit of others use 1.5, 1.57, and so on. Putting it simply, most tube optic mounts vary based on manufacturer, but will fall in a range between the absolute co-witness height and our next well-known height, the lower 1/3. And so the lower 1/3 refers to placing the sight where the irons are only visible and the very bottom portion of the optic, assuming it's a dot style optic. That said, when it comes to measuring exactly here, much like the tube optic standard, there isn't a standardized, regimented height for this designation either. Most 1/3 mounts are between 1.57 and 1.7 inches above the receiver, again, based on manufacturer. As a point of reference here, this is where the EOTech EXPS series will sit with the built-in QD base mount. Next, we have 193. As you may have guessed, it is 1.93 inches above the receiver top. This height usually doesn't allow standard iron sights to be visible through the optic, and the irons are also usually blocked by the mount, so keep that in mind if you choose this height. If you're mounting a tube optic and want to go taller than the aforementioned tube optic standard, this is the next major height offered by a variety of manufacturers. You'll recall we mentioned the standard tube mount height is between 1.42 to 1.57 inches. So aside from some unique exceptions, for example, the Badger 1.7 mount, this is the next place you'll find mounts readily available for LPVOs that is shared across various manufacturers. Keep in mind that if you do choose to mount a tube optic at this height and you want to mount a 12 o'clock dot above the optic, then that dot is going to be extremely high, and unless you have a giraffe neck, you may want to rethink going 193 for the base. Lastly, we have 226. This is the height of the Unity Tactical fast mount system, which aligns very closely with an optic integrated into the top of a classic carry handle. Some of these mounts and optic setups allow the use of irons below the optic. When you get to this height, you're really looking at just red dot mounting options. It's worth mentioning there are a few configurations we're glossing over that are manufacturer unique or specific. For example, the CAC or Knights Armament Company Skyscraper is a unique micro dot mount that comes in nearer to 2.33 inches. There's also a Unity tube mount that sits at 2.06 inches, about a tenth taller than the more standard 1.93 mount. There's also the GBRS Hydra, which is an extremely purpose-built ultra-tall mount at 2.9 inches, so on and so forth. But these are not standards. They're more niche or unique use cases. Now, allow us to save you one of the great blunders. The lowest height mount that you should consider choosing for a standard AR platform where you intend to mount atop the receiver is the absolute co-witness height as identified. This isn't to say shorter mounts don't exist. They absolutely do. They're simply designed for other applications. If you drop below absolute height, you'll find it's nearly impossible to get low enough behind the gun to even see through the optic in the standing position. So, is there a best height? It's an interesting question. Over the years, we've put tens of thousands of rounds on absolute, lower 1/3, and 193 height guns. We've won events and matches shooting absolute, lower 1/3, and 193 height guns. With that said, shooting the Kalashnikov platform the last couple of years has increased our comfort level with taller mount heights and a more heads-up style of shooting for carbine work, especially when using the intermediate 22 caliber cartridges, which carry much less recoil. Much of the "what is the best" answer can be dictated by intended use. If the rifle is going to be predominantly used as an SPR or distance gun, absolute height or tube optic standard is the way to go, basically 1.5 inches above the receiver. If the rifle is going to be used extensively with night vision, perhaps the 193 or 226 mount would be the correct choice. But beyond that, if we're talking about a general purpose rifle, a lot of the height considerations come down to preference and practice. I found that I tend to be most comfortable nowadays with a 193 main optic height. I can go to lower 1/3, but given the choice, I wouldn't. Even most of my LPVOs sit on 193 mounts nowadays. I found that the decrease in recoil control from lifting slightly higher off the stock is offset by not dipping my head down and looking out the top of my eye. If you're choosing your first optic for a general purpose setup, we suggest a look at the lower 1/3 or even the 193 as a starting point to begin testing and feeling what works for you. Lower 1/3 will give you a bit more positive cheek weld and mount, whereas the 193 will be a bit biased towards a more heads-up style. In any case, remember that mount height is heavily subjective. People will hop online and declare a certain height is perfect or that another height is stupid. But frankly, much of that is just noise. If you happen to feel comfortable at a certain height, don't go and buy a different mount because someone online told you the height that you perform with isn't cool. A final key point of notation here. The height stated for a mount will be how high the optic sits above the receiver top, not how high the optic sits above the bore. A standard AR has approximately 1.2, 1.25 inches of space between the bore to the top of the receiver. So when accounting for mechanical offset or running data as part of a ballistic calculation and or zeroing, remember to take that additional 1.2 inches and add it to your optic height to get the appropriate info. Now, that was a lot of information to take in. And we didn't even talk about risers, which can be used to raise the receiver top height and gain additional height for the optics with built-in mounts. So if you have a question, be sure to drop it in the comments below. And please, let us know what optic mount and height you've selected as your go-to. We look forward to hearing from you in the comments, and until next time, we'll see you on the range.
716 is 096, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green. How copy, over?
096, this is 716, roger, over. 16, 091, 1 pack, green, green, over. This is 716, roger, over.
16, 2, 1 Victor, 2 packs, Redcon 1, over.